Hello students, welcome to engineering assignments. In engineering assignments, we were studying a subject called as disaster management, and in disaster management we are going to study a very important topic, that is Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. So Sendai Framework. So before beginning of the Sendai Framework in 1994, Yokomo Summit was there. After that, a Hydro Framework for Action, that is HFA. The HFA was introduced in 2005 and it lasted till 2015. It is basically for building reliance of the nation and community, and India is a signatory of this. Next came the Sendai Framework. The framework was adopted at the 3rd UN World Conference on the Disaster Risk Reduction, which was held at Sendai, Japan, and it was on March 18, 2015. The Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction 2015 to 2030 is a 15-year voluntary non-binding agreement, and our India is also a signatory of Sendai Framework. The representatives from 187 countries have adopted Sendai Framework. It aims to achieve the subsequent reduction of the disaster risk and loss in the life, livelihood, health, and in the economic, physical, social, cultural and environmental assets of the person, businesses, communities and the countries over next 15 years. And our framework works in hand with other 2030 Agenda Agreement, including the Paris Agreement on the Climatic Change, the Addis Ababa Action Agenda on Financing for the Development, and New Urban Agenda. And our National Disaster Management Plan 2016 NDMP is based on the Sendai Framework. And according to this NDMP, our disaster risk reduction should be completed by 2030 in a short time, that is 5 years, and in a medium time of 10 years and a long time of 15 years. There are 4 major priorities of this action. First one is understanding risk reduction. It is basically for ensuring the policies and practices of disaster risk management, and it is based on the clear understanding of the vulnerability, capacity, exposure to the hazard. Second one is strengthening disaster risk governance to manage the disaster risk. This is having a clear strategy, a strong institution, law and budget to ensure efficient management of the disaster risk. Next one is investing in the disaster risk reduction for reliance. It includes all the public and private investment in which we can prevent and reduce the disaster. The final one is enhancing disaster preparedness for effective response and to build back better in the recovery, rehabilitation and the construction. There are 7 global targets of our Sendai framework. So I have divided this into 2 categories. One is about the reduction and one is to increase. So the first one is all about the reduction, substantial reduction of the global disaster mortality rate by 2030. It is aiming to lower the average per 1 lakh global mortality rate in the decade 2020 and 2030 compared to the period of 2005 and 2015. Next one is substantial reduce the number of people affected globally by 2030. So aiming is to lower the average global figure per lakh in the decade of 2020 and 2030 compared to the period 2005 and 2015. Next one is reduce the direct disaster economic loss in relation to global gross domestic product (GDP) by 2030. Substantial reduce disaster damages to critical infrastructure and disruptions of basic services, among them health and educational facility, including through developing their reliance by 2030. By 2030 we have to decrease all these 4 points. Next one is what all things to be increased. The fifth one is substantial increase the number of countries with national and local disaster risk reduction strategy by 2030. Next one, substantially enhance the international cooperation to developing countries through adequate and sustainable support to complement their national action for implementing of the present framework by 2030. Next one, substantially increase availability of and access the multi-hazard early warning system and disaster risk information and assessment to the people by 2030. Next one is guiding principle. The first one is each state has the primary responsibility to prevent and reduce the disaster risk, including through international, regional and sub-regional, transboundary and bilateral cooperation. Next one is disaster risk reduction requires that the responsibility be shared by the central government and be relevant nations, authorities, sectors and stakeholders as appropriate to their national circumstances and system of governance. Next, the third one is managing the risk of the disaster, aimed at protecting the person's property, health, livelihood and productive assets, as well as the cultural and environmental assets, while promoting and protecting all human rights, including the right to development. Next, the fourth point is disaster risk reduction requires an all of society engagement, partnership. It also requires empowerment and inclusive accessibility and non-discriminatory participation, paying attention to people affected by disaster, especially the poorest. A gender, age, disability and culture perspective should be integrated in all policies and practices, and women and the youth leadership should be promoted. Okay, so everybody should participate in the disaster risk reduction. You should not eliminate anyone based on the gender, age, disability, any culture and all. In this context, special attention should be paid to the improvement of organized voluntary work of the citizen. Fifth point is disaster risk and management depends on the coordination mechanism within and across sectors with relevant stakeholders at all levels, and it requires a full engagement of all state institutions of an executive and legislative nature at the national as well as the local level, and a clear articulate of the responsibility across public and private stakeholders, including business, academy, to ensure mutual outsearch, partnership, complementary in the role of accountability and follow-up. Next one, why enabling, guiding and coordinating role of national and federal state government remains essential. It is necessary to empower local authority and local community to reduce disaster risk, including through resources, incentives, decision-making responsibility as appropriate. Now, the seventh point is disaster risk reduction requires a multi-hazard approach. That is, it should not be centric to a single hazard. It must be multi-hazard approach. An inclusive risk-informed decision-making based on open exchange and dissemination of disaggregated data, including the sex, age, disability, as well as on the easily accessible, up-to-date, comprehensible, science-based, non-sensitive risk information complemented by traditional knowledge. Next point is the development, the strength and implementation of relevant policies, plans, practices and mechanisms need to aim at the coherence as appropriate across sustainable development and growth, food security, health and safety, climate change and variability, environmental management and disaster risk reduction agendas. Disaster risk reduction is essential to achieve a sustainable development. Next, ninth point is, while the drivers of the disaster risk may be local, national, regional or global in scope, disaster risk have local and specific characteristics that must be understood for determination of measures to reduce disaster risk. Now the 10th point is addressing underlying disaster risk factors through disaster risk informed public and private investment is more cost effective than primary reliance on the post disaster response and recovery and contribute to sustainable development. The next point, 11th point is in the post-disaster recovery, rehabilitation and construction phase, it is critical to prevent the creation of and to reduce the disaster risk by building back better. That is, you have to come back to the original, that is to bring back to the original living condition, and increasing public education and awareness of the disaster risk. Next one is an effective and meaningful global partnership and the further strengthening of the international cooperation, including the fulfillment of respective commitments of official development assistance by the developed countries, are essential for effective disaster risk management. Now, the last point in it is developing countries, in a particular that least developed countries, small islands, developing states, landlocked developing countries and African countries, as well as middle income and other countries facing specific disaster risk challenges, need adequate, sustainable and timely provision of support, including through finance, technology transfer and capacity building, tailored to their need and priorities as identified by them. So these 13 points are also very important. Now about the Sendai Framework Readiness Review, UNISDR 2017. And it found that there is a critical data gap exists in the area of disaster loss, disaster cooperation, and many aspects of early warning, risk information, and disaster risk reduction strategies. The review confirms that unless gaps in the data availability, quality, accessibility are addressed, the country's ability to ensure accurate, timely and high quality monitoring and reporting of implementation across all target and priorities of Sendai framework will be severely impaired. India has designated as a champion of disaster risk reduction for the effort to facilitate regional support towards enabling community reliance in the Asian Pacific region. So India is a champion of it. Now, United Nations Office of DRR, UNISDR, has declared our India as a first regional champion after the Sendai Agreement. So that's all about the Sendai framework. Thank you students. Thank you for watching my video.